At my wedding, my mother-in-law stood up and made an announcement. My son is marrying a gold digger. He refuses to see it, but everyone else should. Guests laughed. My husband froze. So I stood up, took the microphone, and what I revealed destroyed her family. Brace yourself, because what you are about to hear is not just a story, but a reckoning. Comment below where you are watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. That night, I understood that a wedding, instead of uniting people, can peel open the quiet rot hiding underneath a family's polished surface, exposing everything they prayed the world would never see. My name is Elena Marquez. I am 26 years old, and I never imagined that the day I wore a white dress would be the same day I uncovered the truth about the woman who spent years trying to break me. Yet, if I'm honest, the explosion at the altar did not begin there. It began months earlier, with moments so small, I almost ignored them. The kind of moments that whisper rather than scream, that coil beneath the surface until the right amount of pressure forces them to erupt. I still remember the afternoon Ashton told me he wanted me to meet his mother. Savannah was warm in that slow southern way, the kind of warmth that hums against your skin while the Spanish moss sways lazily above you. And we sat on the park steps, iced coffee melting between our fingers, as he squeezed my hand gently and said, almost apologetically, "She's a lot, Elena. Just don't take her too seriously." I smiled then, foolishly confident that love could soften any rough edge, believing that if I showed sincerity, respect, and patience, his mother would eventually see me the way he did. Yet, what I did not understand was that Margaret Whitford was not the kind of woman who wanted to understand. She was the kind who needed to dominate, to control the emotional temperature of every room, to ensure all attention flowed toward her. And from the moment she laid eyes on me, I felt the chill of someone who had already decided I did not belong. Our first dinner together took place in a quiet, historic restaurant with white tablecloths and low music, the sort of place meant for warmth and conversation. Yet, the moment we sat down, she didn't smile, didn't greet me, barely even acknowledged my existence until she could turn me into a topic to dissect. She asked what I did for work, not with interest, but evaluation. Asked whether my income was stable. Asked if my parents owned property, or if I came from modest background. Asked if I carried student debt. And, finally, with a tilt of her head that felt like a dismissal, coded in politeness, asked whether I expected her son to support me financially in the future. I answered everything calmly, aware that Ashton was shifting uncomfortably beside me, trying to interrupt her interrogation. But Margaret had the confidence of a woman who believed every word she spoke was a public service. She had decided who I was long before she asked a single question, and her questions existed only to confirm her assumptions. When the food arrived, she barely touched it, too busy steering the conversation into subtle insults cloaked as maternal concern. And each time Ashton tried to defend me, she paused, gave him a soft sigh, and redirected him the way a puppeteer gently tugs a string, reminding him without saying it that he was hers first and would remain so as long as she held the emotional leash she'd tied around him years before. Looking back now, I can see how clear it was, how every moment carried that quiet tension of a woman testing the limits of her control. Yet, at the time, I told myself she just needed time, that boundaries were bridges, that patience was enough. I was wrong. The months leading up to the wedding were a slow tightening of that invisible rope. She questioned every decision Ashton and I made, inserted herself into every plan, and whenever he chose me in small ways, she responded with guilt, with backhanded comments, with dramatic tears that appeared and disappeared with surgical precision. And I began to understand why Ashton had warned me in that soft voice beneath the oak trees. Margaret didn't simply want to be respected. She wanted to be obeyed, admired, worshipped. And the moment Ashton proposed to me, the moment the ring settled onto my finger, she recognized the threat of losing her position at the center of his universe. And from that moment on, the escalation became inevitable. During the rehearsal dinner, she reminded every guest, loudly and repeatedly, that she had paid for the venue. Though she had chosen the cheapest option available, she ignored me entirely in her speech while describing her son's childhood, as though she alone had sculpted him into a masterpiece. She blamed me for Ashton calling her less frequently, and by the time the wedding morning arrived, the air around us felt stretched thin with her silent resentment. When she entered my bridal suite, I greeted her with the biggest smile my nerves allowed. Yet, she walked past me as if I were a shadow and began complimenting my bridesmaids one by one while never once acknowledging the woman in the white dress. I felt something inside me constrict, but I stayed gentle. I told myself it was only one day, only a few hours, and I could survive anything for the sake of peace. But peace was never her intention. That evening, standing before 200 guests, she lifted the microphone as though it belonged to her, and with the confidence of a woman who believed she was untouchable, she called me a gold digger, claimed I had trapped her son, insisted everyone should know the truth she had invented. And when the laughter broke across the room, like glass falling from a chandelier, when Ashton froze beside her with fear in his eyes, when I felt humiliation press like a hand against my chest, something in me finally rose, quiet but unbreakable. I stood up, reached for the microphone, and prepared to reveal the truth she never expected me to know. The truth that would dismantle the Whitford family from the inside out. But before I tell you what I said that night, before I tell you why her smile finally cracked, you need to understand what pushed me there. Because the destruction of that family did not begin with her insult. It began long before, in the moments she thought were invisible, in the secrets she believed were buried, in the lies she never imagined would find their way back to her. And I promise you this, when the truth finally came out, the sound of their world breaking was louder than her laughter ever was. The first sign that Margaret wasn't simply difficult, but dangerous, came the week she accidentally took my wedding dress from the boutique. A moment that even now feels surreal because of how casually she lied about it, how effortlessly she twisted her own wrongdoing into a performance so believable that half the family praised her for her generosity. The boutique called Ashton first, saying his mother had picked up the bride's gown for alterations she claimed were approved. He thought it was a misunderstanding, but I felt something cold inside me settle because Margaret never did anything accidentally. When Ashton hung up and looked at me with confusion, I already knew this was deliberate. We drove to her house that day, and when she opened the door, she greeted us with exaggerated shock, placing a hand against her chest as if deeply wounded. I was only trying to help, she insisted, before we even stepped inside. The dress looked wrinkled, and I didn't want Elena to be embarrassed. You should thank me, not scold me. She said it with a voice trembling just enough to sound victimized, but her eyes were bright with something sharp, almost triumphant. I asked to see the dress. Her smile faltered. She led us to the guest room, and I felt my breath slip the moment I saw it. My gown wasn't just wrinkled, it was bent, torn, crushed against the corner of a chair, like someone had tried squeezing into it, ripping the delicate seams along the bodice, stretching the lace near the hips, snapping the invisible back buttons, as if her body had forced the fabric past its limit. My throat tightened. Ashton froze. Margaret gasped theatrically, pressing both hands to her mouth. "Oh, heavens! Did the boutique do that?" she exclaimed, but her voice cracked unnaturally, like someone who hadn't rehearsed this lie ahead of time. Ashton whispered, "Mom, what did you do?" And that was when she snapped. Her face shifted, just for a second, from guilt to rage. "I was trying to help her," she shouted, then immediately softened her tone again. "I just wanted to make sure she looked her best. I thought I could try it on to see if any alterations were needed for the silhouette. I was being thoughtful." Thoughtful. She had torn my wedding dress, violated my boundaries, inserted herself into something deeply personal. And all she needed to do was claim she meant well, because she knew Ashton's heart, his good, soft, forgiving heart, was her shield. When he insisted she pay for the damage, she burst into tears so loudly that her husband came in from the yard, startled. Margaret collapsed dramatically into his arms, sobbing that I had humiliated her, that I had accused her unfairly, that she was just trying to be like a second mother to me. I stood there, stunned, watching a grown woman weaponize her tears with the skill of someone who had done it her entire life. She looked at Ashton through wet eyelashes and whispered, "Don't you see? She's trying to come between us." That was the moment I realized something important. Margaret never wanted a daughter-in-law. She wanted an audience, and I wasn't applauding. When we left the house that afternoon, Ashton apologized to me again and again, but what broke me wasn't the dress. It was the look in his eyes, the confusion, the guilt, the ache of a child torn between truth and loyalty. That night, as I lay awake, I understood that Margaret's cruelty wasn't emotional immaturity. It was strategy. And she had played this game before. The second wave didn't come from what Margaret did to me directly, but from what she told everyone else when she thought I wouldn't hear it. In the days after the wedding gown incident, relatives began acting strangely around me. Too polite, too distant, too cautious, as if they were waiting for me to explode or confirm a rumor they were afraid to ask about. Ashton's cousin Taylor was the first to slip. She pulled me aside during a family barbecue, her voice low, her eyes darting nervously toward Margaret, who sat across the yard pretending not to watch us. "I just want you to know, I don't believe what she said about you." My heartbeat changed rhythm. "What did she say?" Taylor hesitated, swallowing hard. "That you screamed at her, that you told her she was useless, that you mocked her size when she tried on your dress." My breath caught. "What?" Taylor nodded, her expression apologetic. "She said you pushed past her and said, 'You'll never look like me.'" I almost laughed from disbelief, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity was so vast, it became dizzying. I had been horrified. I had been shaking. I had barely spoken. Yet Margaret had rewritten the scene into a performance where I was the villain. I heard her, and she had played it convincingly enough that several relatives avoided eye contact with me the entire afternoon. Later that night, Ashton received a call from his mother's sister, a woman he trusted. She said Margaret had told the family I'd threatened to cancel the wedding unless Ashton cut his mother off financially, and that I wanted to replace her in the family hierarchy. When Ashton explained what actually happened, she gasped softly and said, "Oh dear, that's not the story Margaret told." And that was when I learned Margaret was not simply lying. She was constructing an alternate reality, a version where she was the fragile matriarch, unfairly attacked, desperately trying to maintain a relationship with a son being poisoned by a jealous woman. And because she had spent decades crafting a reputation as the elegant, generous, overly involved mother, people believed her. When I saw her next, she smiled sweetly, kissing my cheek as if nothing had happened, but her eyes glittered with challenge, daring me to confront her publicly where she could cry again, perform again, manipulate again. Instead, I watched, quietly, carefully. And the more I watched, the more I saw. Margaret didn't just want me gone. She wanted control over the narrative, over Ashton, over how everyone saw us. And the more unstable her life became behind closed doors, the more vicious she grew in the shadows. One night, Ashton showed me a text Margaret sent him. "If Elena truly loved you, she wouldn't drive a wedge between us." Another said, "She wants your money. Everyone sees it, but you." Another, "You will regret choosing her." And the most chilling, "She will replace me. Don't let her." For the first time, I wasn't just dealing with a cruel woman. I was dealing with a woman terrified of losing power she no longer possessed. And fear, like that, makes people dangerous. The night everything crystallized, the night I stopped wondering and finally knew Margaret was hiding something much darker than jealousy, began with a simple mistake. She forgot to lock her office door. We were at her house for a small family gathering, one she organized purely to monitor how much influence I still had over Ashton. She kept watching me from across the room, smiling politely when others looked, but glaring when their backs turned. Near the end of the evening, Ashton went outside with his father, and Margaret slipped away upstairs, too quickly, too quietly, like someone needing to check on something they didn't want anyone else to see. A few minutes later, I went to look for the restroom, and walked past her home office, the door slightly ajar, the light still on. Papers covered the desk, a drawer stood open, and on top of the drawer was something I recognized from the guest room weeks earlier, an envelope from Apex Collections Group. I stepped closer. The envelope wasn't sealed, and beneath it were more letters, some from debt recovery agencies, some from banks regarding overdue loan payments, some stamped in red with words that made my stomach twist. Final notice. Account delinquent. Legal action pending. My breath trembled. This wasn't a few overdue bills. This was destruction. Quiet, secret destruction. Then I saw something worse. Documents with Ashton's name on them. His information, his credit score, his old address, a partially filled credit application using his details. Never submitted, but saved. My entire body went cold. She wasn't just meddling, she wasn't just lying, she wasn't just dramatic. She was using her son's identity as a backup plan for her financial collapse. Footsteps approached. I pushed the drawer closed just before Margaret appeared in the hallway, her smile tight, her voice sweetness stretched thin. "Elena, what are you doing upstairs?" she asked gently, too gently. I turned toward her, my heartbeat steady now in a way that surprised even me. "Looking for the bathroom," I answered calmly. Her eyes flicked toward the office door, then back to me, and for a moment her expression cracked. Not fully, but enough for me to see what lived beneath that carefully painted face. Fear. Real fear. Not of me, not of exposure, but of losing her last escape route. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're becoming very nosy," she whispered. "Curiosity ruins marriages." And then she smiled, not kindly, but as a threat. That was the moment everything aligned. The ruined dress, the lies, the whispers, the manipulation, the financial anomalies. She wasn't trying to destroy me. She was trying to save herself. And I was standing exactly where she didn't want me, between her and the truth. I walked past her slowly, feeling her eyes burning against my back as I descended the stairs. That night, I didn't tell Ashton everything, only enough to begin unraveling the thread carefully, safely, in the right order. Because exposing someone like Margaret wasn't just about truth. It was about timing. And as I lay awake beside him, listening to the slow rise and fall of his breath, I understood something with crystal clarity. Margaret's world was collapsing, and the only person she blamed for its fall was me. When I finally understood the depth of Margaret's financial ruin, it felt as though the ground beneath us had shifted. Not violently, but with the slow, inevitable slide of a foundation giving way. And for the first time, I saw her actions not as random cruelty, but as the desperate survival tactics of a woman whose life was built on borrowed money, borrowed image, borrowed control. And the moment she sensed I had the power to expose her, she escalated in ways I hadn't imagined. The next week was a quiet storm, not the kind that shatters windows, but the kind that builds pressure silently, layering tension inside the walls until something must crack to release it. Margaret had stopped knocking on our door, stopped screaming in the driveway, stopped leaving voicemails laced with melodrama, and that silence was far more unnerving than her chaos. because silence meant she was planning, recalibrating, repositioning herself the way someone adjusts their mask before stepping back onto a stage. On a Thursday afternoon, just as I was returning from the grocery store, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You won't destroy my family. I won't let you." My pulse steadied rather than quickened. I deleted nothing, documented everything, because I knew enough now to recognize that Margaret didn't send threats unless she felt cornered. And someone like her, cornered, became dangerous. That evening, when Ashton came home, his face was tight, guarded, as though he carried something heavy he wasn't ready to say. I asked what was wrong, and he sat at the edge of the bed, ran his hand through his hair, and said quietly, "Mom has been reaching out to the rest of the family. She's telling them you're manipulating me, that you're trying to isolate me from everyone." My chest tightened, not because I cared what distant relatives believed, but because I knew exactly what Margaret was doing. She was rebuilding her image by casting me as the villain, stitching together a narrative where she was the wounded mother fighting to save her son from the woman who corrupted him. I asked him what he said to them, and he sighed, his voice wavering with frustration rather than doubt. "I told them she's lying. I told them she destroyed your dress and she crossed boundaries, and she hasn't been honest about anything. But Elena, they don't believe me. They think she's just emotional because the wedding was postponed." And there it was, the truth I had feared from the moment I met her. Margaret didn't act alone. She acted within a system that rewarded her theatrics, a family conditioned to protect her feelings above everything else, a network of enablers who insisted her fragility was sacred. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the soft rhythm of Ashton's breathing, my mind replaying every moment Margaret had twisted truth into something unrecognizable. I knew then that waiting quietly, hoping she would stop, would only embolden her. Women like Margaret didn't retreat when confronted. They attacked harder. And if I didn't anchor myself now, she would rewrite our story in a way that swallowed everything Ashton and I were fighting to rebuild. The next escalation came faster than I expected. 2 days later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Ashton's aunt, a woman I had always liked, her voice trembling with the weight of something she struggled to say. "Elena, I thought you should know. Margaret's been telling everyone that you stole from her." For a moment, the world sharpened, too bright, too focused, as if my senses had narrowed into a single point. "Stole what?" I asked, my voice steady despite the burn rising in my throat. "She won't say specifics," his aunt whispered. "Just that she caught you going through her things and that she's missing valuables. And Elena, she's trying to convince the family to file a report." I closed my eyes, the silence stretching long and thin between us. Margaret wasn't just lying. She was setting a trap, planting seeds she could later use as evidence, trying to flip the narrative before I exposed her secret. She knew I held the documents of her debt. She knew I had screenshots of her overdue accounts. She knew I could prove she used Ashton's identity to open credit. She knew the real gold digger wasn't me. It was her. And she was preemptively destroying my credibility before I had the chance to speak. I thanked his aunt, hung up, and sat at the edge of the bed staring at the window as the late afternoon sun spilled across the floor, turning everything golden and fragile. A contrast so gentle it felt cruel compared to the battle unfolding around us. When Ashton came home that evening, I told him everything. Every call, every message, every accusation. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I saw something harden in his expression, something sharp and decisive. "She's done," he said quietly, his voice low with a strength I had been waiting to hear. "She wants a war? Fine, but she's not going to win it." We sat together at the dining table, the house finally still, and I showed him the bank statements, the overdue bills, the line of credit opened in his name, the collector's notices, the evidence she had spent years hiding under a mask of luxury. Watching his face shift from confusion to disbelief to a profound, quiet hurt was one of the most painful moments of my life. Because no matter what Margaret had done to me, she had wounded him more deeply by weaponizing the love he had always given her freely. He whispered, almost to himself, "She used my name, my credit, my future." And then he sank his face into his hands, his shoulders trembling not from anger, but grief. The grief of a son realizing the mother he loved had chosen lies over loyalty. I touched his arm gently, and he looked at me with eyes heavy with betrayal. "We have to use this," I said softly. "If she's willing to lie to them about me, she'll keep escalating until she destroys everything. We need to protect ourselves." He nodded slowly, wiping his face, and I watched the shift inside him, the slow dismantling of the pedestal he had built for her, the recognition that the woman he defended for years was not the woman she pretended to be. That night, we made a plan. Calm, careful, deliberate. But before we could act, Margaret escalated one more time, crossing a line that forced every truth into the open. She contacted Ashton's employer. She told them I was manipulating him. She told them he was mentally unstable. She told them I threatened her safety. She left a voicemail so dramatic, so theatrical, it bordered on unhinged. And that was her fatal mistake. Because she forgot something crucial. Companies save voicemails, and lies leave fingerprints. The war she wanted had officially begun, and I no longer had any reason to hold back. When Margaret contacted Ashton's employer and left a voicemail dripping with accusations so grotesquely dramatic, they bordered on delusion. Something irreversible shifted in the air, as if the thread she'd been using to hold together the illusion of her perfect life finally snapped under the strain of her own desperation, and the collapse she had spent years outrunning began unfolding faster than she could rebuild the facade. The next morning, the HR manager at Ashton's company called him into a private meeting, not with suspicion, but with concern. Because the voicemail Margaret had left didn't paint a picture of a protective mother. It painted the outline of someone unraveling, someone spinning fantasies so disconnected from reality that even strangers could hear the fractures in her voice. When Ashton came home that evening, he sat down across from me, his face pale, his shoulders slumped, and he whispered. They played me the message. Elena, she said you were controlling my mind. She said you were isolating me from the family. She said you threatened to kill her if she came near me again. I stared at him, stunned, not by her lies. They were predictable, but by the sheer escalation. The way she crafted delusions so vividly, they sounded like the paranoia of someone afraid of her own shadow. Ashton rubbed his temples, exhausted, and murmured, They know it's not true. But they said I should consider a restraining order, not against you, against her. As he said those words, I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not relief, but a quiet sorrow. Because, despite everything Margaret had done, despite every wound she inflicted, part of me understood that people don't reach this level of destruction unless they're drowning in something deeper than envy or malice. But that understanding didn't erase the danger. It didn't soften the consequences. She had crossed into territory where lies weren't mere insults. They were weapons aimed at our livelihood, our sanity, our safety. That night, we sat together, reviewing every piece of evidence, every message, every voicemail, every document tied to her debt, every screenshot, every bank notification. And with each new puzzle piece, the truth became clearer. Margaret wasn't simply manipulative. She was living inside a collapsing world she had constructed on credit, deception, and the belief that she could control reality by controlling the narrative around her. When people like her sense exposure coming, they don't apologize. They double down. And that's exactly what she did. Over the next week, she reached out to nearly every member of Ashton's extended family, weaving new stories each time. She claimed I'd stolen jewelry from her, that I was blackmailing her, that I was pregnant and forcing Ashton to marry me, that I was mentally unstable, that I was using him for money, that I was threatening to publicly embarrass the family unless they accepted me. Each version contradicted the last. But the emotional impact of her performance was powerful enough that some relatives, those who always defended her, chose to believe her without question. They called Ashton, scolded him, accused him of abandoning his mother in her time of crisis, demanded he man up and protect her, as though he owed her unconditional loyalty simply because she gave birth to him. But others, the relatives who had quietly suffered her manipulation for years, began reaching out to us privately, sending messages that started with tentative apologies and ended with confessions they had been too afraid to share before. One cousin wrote, She did the same thing when my sister got engaged. She can't stand losing control. Another admitted, Margaret lies when she feels cornered. Always has. The family just covers for her because it's easier than fighting her. And then there was her brother, Ashton's uncle, who finally broke his long silence with a message that chilled me in a way no accusation ever could. She's been struggling for years. You two just happened to be the first ones who didn't bend. I felt the weight of that sentence settle into my bones. The web was much larger than I thought. The next escalation came when Margaret showed up unannounced at Ashton's workplace, storming through the lobby with the force of a woman who believed consequences didn't apply to her. demanding to speak to him, claiming she needed to rescue her son from the witch controlling him. Security escorted her out, but she screamed all the way to the parking lot that Ashton would regret betraying his own blood, drawing the kind of attention she feared more than anything: public humiliation. Her spiral was now visible to everyone, not just to us. Later that afternoon, we received a message from her husband, Ashton's father, a gentleman who rarely spoke, rarely intervened, always standing slightly behind Margaret, like a shadow shaped into human form. His message was short, just a handful of words, but they trembled with something I had not expected: guilt. "I'm sorry for everything. She needs help." Those words were the first crack of honesty I had ever seen from him, and they rattled something in me, trembling not with vindication, but with the heartbreaking truth that silence can be as harmful as cruelty when it enables someone's destruction. The turning point came 2 days later when Ashton's cousin sent us a screenshot, a photo of Margaret standing in front of a pawn shop, arguing with the clerk, her voice raised, her face twisted with a mixture of anger and desperation. The image alone didn't reveal much, but the caption from the cousin did. "Elena, that necklace she's holding, that's her fake heirloom. She's trying to sell it again." And suddenly, everything clicked. Margaret had pawned jewelry before. She had sold things behind her husband's back. She had recycled lies the same way she recycled stories about her wealth. Her financial collapse wasn't an accident. It was a pattern built on living beyond her means while blaming the world for every consequence. Ashton stared at the photo for a long time, his silence thick, heavy, almost suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. "Elena, I think everything she said about you being a gold digger is because she's the one who drained everything. She stole my future because she ruined her own." And though I didn't speak it aloud, I knew he was right. Margaret wasn't trying to protect him from me. She was trying to protect herself from the truth. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. The woman who called me a gold digger at my own wedding was drowning in debt, secrets, and fear. And her cruelty toward me wasn't personal. It was survival. If she convinced the world that I was the danger, no one would look closely enough to see that the real danger was her. But the moment she learned we had proof of everything, she didn't break down or apologize. She retaliated with something far worse than lies. She reached for the one thing she thought could still save her: her reputation. And in doing so, she set the stage for the night my truth finally met her performance head on. The night everything exploded. The night everything finally snapped didn't begin with shouting or breaking glass or slam doors. It began with a silence so heavy it made the air thicken around us. A silence that felt like the moment before a storm touches ground, where the world holds its breath, knowing something irreversible is coming. Ashton and I had spent the entire day gathering the last pieces of evidence we needed, not because we wanted revenge, but because we needed protection from a woman who had proven again and again that she would burn down her own life if it meant she could blame the smoke on someone else. We had everything organized now: copies of financial records, emails from collectors, proof of the credit line opened in Ashton's name, the voicemail she left for his employer, the messages accusing me of crimes she invented, every attempt she made to weaponize tears into power. When the sun set that evening, spreading soft gold over the quiet Savannah neighborhood, I felt something inside me shift. Not fear, not anger, but a calm certainty that whatever happened next would define the rest of our lives. Margaret's decline was no longer a pattern. It had become a free fall. Around 9, the doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, and I knew even before I stood up that it was her. Because no one else in our lives rang the bell that way, with a rhythm that demanded being heard. Ashton stiffened beside me, his breath slowing the way it does when someone braces for impact, and he whispered, "She wasn't supposed to know we're home." But Margaret knew 1,000 things she shouldn't know. She always had a way of inserting herself into our most private moments, slipping in through cracks we didn't realize were open. When I opened the door, she stood there in the porch light, her hair wild from the wind, her eyes rimmed with red, but fierce with something unhinged, her hands gripping her purse tightly against her chest, as if it were a shield. Her face carried the desperation of someone who had exhausted every excuse, every lie, every performance, yet refused to accept defeat. She didn't ask permission to enter. She pushed forward, stepping inside with the entitlement of someone who believed every threshold existed for her to cross. Ashton moved between us instinctively, blocking her path deeper into the house, and for a moment, the three of us stood in a triangle of tension so intense it felt like the walls themselves were waiting to see who would move first. "You're trying to destroy me," she said, her voice trembling with fury rather than fear. "I know what you're doing. You're collecting things. You're plotting. You want to ruin my life." I took a slow breath, steady and controlled, resisting the urge to respond with the anger sitting heavy in my chest. I said quietly, "You're ruining your own life, Margaret. We're just trying to protect ourselves." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cracked midair, and stepped closer until I could see the gloss of tears gathering in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the adrenaline of losing control. "Protect yourselves? From what? From me? Your mother?" She pressed a hand to her chest dramatically. "I gave him everything. Everything. And this is how he repays me? By taking your side over mine?" Ashton clenched his jaw, his voice low but steady as he said, "Mom, stop. Please. You need help." But she wasn't listening. She hadn't listened in months. She pointed at me, her finger trembling slightly, and hissed, "You did this. You turned him against me. You're poisoning him, poisoning this family, poisoning everything I spent decades building." I stepped forward, my voice calm, smooth, deliberately gentle, because sometimes gentleness cuts deeper than anger. "Margaret, no one turned him against you. You did that yourself." For a moment, everything froze. Her face went still, her breath caught, her eyes widened the way someone's eyes widen when they see the truth, reflected in someone else's gaze. Then came the explosion. She lunged toward the dining table, grabbed a stack of the documents we had left there earlier, some printed, some handwritten, some highlighted, and she began tearing through them, ripping pages with a fury so violent it echoed through the house. "You won't use this against me!" she screamed, shredding bank statements, credit notices, overdue bills, anything she could reach. Ashton grabbed her wrists gently but firmly, trying to stop her without hurting her, and she wrenched away, collapsing against the table, breathless, trembling, completely undone. "I am not the villain," she whispered, voice shaking as though she were speaking to herself rather than to us. "I am the mother. I am the one who sacrificed. I am the one who deserves loyalty." She lifted her gaze to Ashton then, her eyes wild but pleading, and said the words that broke something deep inside him. "If you don't choose me, I will have nothing left." Ashton didn't respond immediately. He stood there, with the quiet devastation of a son watching the version of his mother he had loved slowly dissolve into someone unrecognizable. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, cracked, and unbearably human. "Mom, you're hurting me. You're hurting her. You're hurting yourself. This isn't love. This is control." Her expression shifted, trembling between rage and heartbreak, and for a moment, she looked like a woman standing on the edge of a cliff she never believed she'd reach. "You think she loves you more than I do?" she whispered harshly, gesturing toward me. "You think she won't leave you the moment she finds something better?" I felt the old accusations stirring in her voice. The obsession, the projection, the belief that love is transactional because she had spent her entire life treating relationships like bargaining chips. I stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, and said softly, "I have never taken anything from you, but you are trying to take everything from him." Something in her cracked then. I felt it more than saw it. She turned away, clutching her purse as if it held the last pieces of her identity, and muttered, "I won't let you expose me. I won't let you embarrass me. I won't let you take what's mine." Ashton let out a long, trembling breath as she backed toward the door, her movements frantic, her dignity unraveling with each step. She left without another word, the door closing behind her with a sound that felt softer than the devastation she carried with her. When the house finally went silent, Ashton collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands, and I sat beside him, placing my hand gently on his back. We didn't speak for a long time, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into the corners of the room. That night, I understood something profound. Margaret wasn't finished. Her retreat wasn't surrender. It was regrouping. And whatever she did next would be her most desperate move, the kind that forced truth into the open, whether we were ready or not. Because when a woman like Margaret feels the world slipping out of her grip, she doesn't let go. She strikes. And the next strike would set the stage for the moment I finally took that microphone and ended everything. The night before the wedding felt like the world was holding its breath, as if every emotion, every unresolved wound, every truth hiding beneath the surface had been gathering momentum for months and was finally ready to collide. And even though the ceremony had been postponed once, the weight of tradition and pressure from both families had pushed it back onto the calendar far faster than either Ashton or I were ready for. By then, everyone had chosen sides without admitting it aloud. Whispers traveled through the family like smoke, soft but suffocating, each person trying to pretend they were neutral, even as their eyes betrayed the fear of being aligned with the wrong truth. Margaret had been silent for 2 days, 2 entire days, without an accusation, without a performance, without a voicemail or a message. And that silence crawled across my skin like cold fingertips, because silence was never peace with her. Silence was her sharpening something I couldn't yet see. That evening, my parents hosted a small pre-wedding gathering at the venue's lounge, meant only for immediate family. A warm space with quiet music, fresh flowers, and soft lighting that made everything feel safer than it truly was. Ashton held my hand as we entered, and I felt him trying to steady his breath, trying to brace himself for whatever version of his mother might walk through the doors. For almost an hour, everything was calm. We spoke with relatives, accepted gentle hugs, answered hopeful questions about moving forward, and even laughed softly at a few jokes. But beneath each smile was a quiet tension, because every person in that room knew the storm had a face and a name and a habit of arriving without warning. And when the ballroom doors swung open, the storm stepped inside. Margaret entered, wearing a deep emerald dress that shimmered beneath the lights. Her makeup flawless, but her eyes too bright, the way eyes get when someone is barely holding together the ruins of their composure. Her husband trailed behind her silently, his posture stiff with dread, as if he already knew the night could not be saved. The room fell silent in a single breath. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses halted mid-air. Every head turned slowly toward her, and she soaked in the attention the way parched earth soaks in rain, lifting her chin with a fragile pride that cracked beneath its own weight. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't smile at us. She simply stared at Ashton with an expression that hovered between heartbreak and accusation, her voice trembling as she said, "I had to come. I'm still your mother." Ashton moved protectively closer to me, his voice steady but tired, as he replied, "Mom, this was supposed to be a peaceful night." But Margaret wasn't listening. She never listened when her emotions were louder than reason. She took one dramatic step into the center of the room, as if the carpet were a stage she had been destined to stand on, and lifted her hands shakily. "I just want to say something," she began, her tone trembling. "Something everyone here deserves to hear." A ripple of anxiety moved through the guests, not chaotic, but subtle. The kind of ripple that comes when people sense a fragile performance about to fracture in front of them. Ashton whispered under his breath, "Don't do this, Mom." But Margaret continued, her voice rising with a desperate intensity. "You all think she's perfect." She gestured toward me with a shaking hand. "But she's been turning my son against me, stealing him from me, isolating him, twisting everything I say. My chest tightened, not from shock, because nothing she said surprised me, but from the exhaustion of knowing that every lie she told chipped away at the world Ashton had trusted all his life. My mother took a small step forward, her face calm but firm, ready to intervene, but Margaret raised her voice louder, pushing past the murmurs. And now, she wants to humiliate me, she cried, the word humiliate trembling on her tongue as though it were her last defense. She wants to expose things, things none of you should hear, things that aren't true, things that will destroy my family. Her voice cracked on the word destroy, echoing across the room like glass cracking under pressure. People shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances, because even those who still defended her began to see the frayed edges of her reality, the way her emotions twisted into something volatile and unpredictable. She turned back to Ashton then, her expression contorted with anguish, and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "How could you do this to me? How could you let her turn you into someone who hates me?" It was the first time I saw the truth reflected so clearly in her son's face. Not hatred, but heartbreak. Ashton stepped forward slowly, his voice trembling with the weight of everything he hadn't said for years. "Mom, no one turned me into anything. I just finally saw what you've been doing." Margaret shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks in streams that felt rehearsed yet real in their desperation. "No, no, no. She's manipulating you. She's using you. She wants your money." And that was the moment the room shifted. The moment the truth she feared most slipped through the cracks of her unraveling mask. Because Ashton, exhausted and raw, finally said the words that split the air open. "Mom, I don't even have money. You used mine." Silence hit the room like a thunderclap. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with the sudden awareness that her secrets were no longer locked behind doors. Only she controlled. A distant cousin whispered, "Used his?" Another murmured, "What is he talking about?" Margaret staggered back slightly, the edges of her composure trembling like thin glass, and for one suspended moment, she looked like a woman peering over the edge of a cliff she had spent years pretending wasn't there. She opened her mouth to respond, but her husband, quiet, weary, haunted, finally stepped forward, placing a hand gently but firmly on her arm. His voice was low, trembling with the exhaustion of someone who had carried silence like a burden for too many years. "Margaret, enough. They deserve to know." And that was when she broke. Not dramatically, not with screaming, but with a soft, strangled sound that escaped her throat, part sob and part rage, as though the truth had reached for her and she no longer had the strength to outrun it. She tried to speak, tried to gather words into a new lie, but the room was already shifting away from her, eyes widening, whispers rising, doubts forming. I stepped closer to Ashton, feeling the tension vibrate through him, knowing that everything leading to this moment had pushed him to the edge of a truth he could no longer ignore. And Margaret, trembling, eyes wild, voice cracking, whispered the words that told me she understood the nightmare had finally caught her. "You wouldn't dare. expose me. But she was wrong, because tomorrow, at the wedding, she weaponized against me. When she stood up with her final insult, when she called me a gold digger in front of everyone, when she believed she had won the war with one perfect humiliation, I picked up the microphone and I dared. The morning of the wedding felt heavier than the humid savannah air, a kind of stillness that clings to the skin and whispers that something is about to break. And even though I tried to focus on the softness of my veil or the quiet rustle of fabric as I dressed, all I could feel was the weight of the night before. The way Margaret's voice cracked when she realized her grip on the narrative had finally slipped. The way the room stared at her, not with admiration, but with dawning recognition, as though they were finally seeing the truth she had tried so hard to bury. My hands trembled slightly as I fastened the clasp of my earrings, not out of fear, but out of a strange clarity, because for the first time since meeting Margaret, I wasn't bracing for her attacks. I was prepared for them. And when the ceremony began and music drifted through the hall, when guests turned in their seats and smiled as I walked down the aisle, when Ashton's eyes softened with something deeper than love, something closer to gratitude, I felt a quiet strength settle inside me, as steady and calm as the tide. Everything looked beautiful, almost dreamlike. The flowers, the candlelight, the soft golden glow across Ashton's cheekbones, the collective breath of hope lingering between every vow we exchanged. But beneath that peace was the knowledge of what Margaret carried into this room, pulled behind her like a shadow she still refused to face. Even seated at the front row, she could not hide the fury simmering under her smile. The way her jaw tightened whenever someone glanced her way, the tremor in her hands as she gripped her champagne flute so tightly I feared it would shatter. After the ceremony came the reception, and for a moment, just a brief, fragile moment, I allowed myself to believe she might stay quiet, that her breakdown the night before had drained her, that perhaps she had no more venom left to spill. But women like Margaret never run out of venom. They only wait for the moment they believe will deliver maximum impact. It happened during the speeches, right when my father finished wiping away a tear from telling the story of the first time he saw me smile after meeting Ashton, when laughter and warmth floated through the room like rising smoke. Margaret stood. No warning, no introduction, just the scrape of her chair, the sharp inhale of her husband, and 200 guests turning toward her like flowers bending toward the sun, even if this sun burned instead of warmed. She walked toward the microphone with the deliberate grace of someone stepping onto a stage she believed belonged to her, her emerald dress catching the light in a way that made her look polished, composed, even regal, until she opened her mouth. "My son is marrying a gold digger," she announced, her voice ringing through the hall with a clarity sharpened by pride and desperation. "He refuses to see it, but everyone else should." Laughter erupted, not joyful, but awkward, confused, nervous, the kind of laughter people use when they don't know what else to do. Ashton froze beside me, his face draining of color, the pain in his eyes deepening with each syllable she spoke. Something inside me went very still, not numb, not shocked, just still like the center of a storm where everything pauses for one suspended heartbeat. And then I stood, not to cry, not to flee, but to take back the narrative she had stolen from me again and again. I stepped forward, approached the microphone, and gently placed my hand on it as Margaret tried to pull it away, whispering fiercely, "You don't get to speak here." I looked her directly in the eyes, my voice low, steady, soft like velvet stretched over steel. "But I will." The room fell silent in a single breath. 200 eyes, 200 questions, 200 truths waiting to be rewritten. Margaret stepped back, her face twisting as she realized this was the moment she had feared, the moment she tried to outrun, the moment she created with her own hands. I turned toward the room, my voice smooth and calm, carrying the weight of everything she had hidden. "My mother-in-law is right," I said softly. "This wedding is not what it seems." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Margaret's lips parted, ready to object, but I continued, unwavering. "So, before this night goes any further, before more lies spill into the air, let me tell you what she didn't want any of you to know." I lifted the stack of documents I had kept tucked beneath the guest book table, a quiet preparation for the storm I knew was coming. "For the last several years, Margaret has been drowning in debt," I said, my voice steady as I revealed the truth she feared more than anything. Not a little debt. Tens of thousands in overdue bills, credit cards in default, collectors calling day and night. Guests shifted, whispers rising like wind through leaves. Her husband closed his eyes, defeated. "She opened a line of credit in Ashton's name," I continued, the words slicing through the room with the precision of truth, without his knowledge, without his consent, using his identity to fund a lifestyle she could no longer maintain. Gasps echoed through the hall. Someone covered their mouth. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." Margaret staggered back as if the truth itself pushed her. But I wasn't finished. "She has pawned jewelry she pretended was heirloom, told relatives lies to cover unpaid bills, drained accounts she kept hidden, and attacked me because she feared I would expose what she spent years concealing." My voice softened, not out of pity, but out of clarity. "She didn't call me a gold digger because it was true. She called me one because she hoped you wouldn't notice. She was the one digging." The room cracked open with murmurs, confusion, disbelief. Margaret reached forward with trembling hands, her voice cracking. You're lying." But her husband stepped toward her, gently taking her arm as he whispered, "Margaret, please, stop." And that soft plea from the man who had protected her silence for decades was the final blow. Her knees buckled. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her performance had finally run out of script. I set the microphone down gently, placing it back onto the stand as the room swallowed the truth in silent gulps. Ashton stepped up beside me, placing his hand on mine, his voice breaking softly as he whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time since meeting him, I felt the weight of his mother lift. Not entirely, not magically, but enough to breathe again. As Margaret was quietly escorted out, her family finally seeing the truth. She fought so desperately to hide. I looked around the room. and felt a strange, quiet peace settle over me. The storm had passed. The truth had been spoken. And even though we would spend months rebuilding the pieces she tried to shatter, Ashton and I stood at the center of the wreckage together, not as victims, but as survivors. And survivors don't fear truth. They rise from it.